Well, welcome to those who are listening or watching on YouTube. Thank you for tuning in that way. And another welcome to those of you who are here with me today. Anybody who might be watching on the closed circuit live stream or on campus. We just heard a rendition of Amazing Grace. It takes me back to one of my first experiences of community and freedom and faith and spirituality. I began my recovery in 1989, identifying as an atheist, but very much threw myself into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and also of Narcotics Anonymous. And I found myself a sponsor whose name was Tom. And coming up, I guess the winter, I think it was the winter of right around my first anniversary, Tom asked me if I wanted to go to a spiritual retreat. And I was like, oh, what? But anyway, because he was my sponsor, I said yes. So I went to this retreat. It was in a Catholic retreat center, which just gave me the heebie-jeebies. And at the end of this Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I had this amazing experience. And we, those of us who were still there, stood out on this hillside. I know exactly where it was. And years later, I would facilitate retreats there. And we sang Amazing Grace together, a cappella. And the subject for today is freedom. And those of you who have experienced the ravages of addiction know that it is fair to call it a bondage, a captivity. It's an awful thing. We get trapped in the tailspin cycle of it's something that gets a hold of us rather than us being able to have whatever degree of choice human beings actually have in their lives, which is a whole separate philosophical debate. But at least to attain the same degree of freedom that those who are not addicted sustain is the most amazing gift. And it's on my heart to recall tomorrow, June 10th, is an important day in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. So in 1935, 89 years ago, is that right? I think it is. 89 years ago, two gentlemen, one was a guy named Bill Wilson, and a lot of you may know these two fellows, and some of you may not, but anyway, Bill Wilson and a physician named Bob Smith, Dr. Bob, would both of them begin to sustain long-term abstinence. They were alcoholic, and it was June 10th, 1935 that became Dr. Bob's sobriety date. And so this is the official marking of the beginning of the movement of Alcoholics Anonymous. Although the story is more complicated than that. So there's a pre-story and a post-story. The Alcoholics Anonymous program doesn't really get codified until 1938 in the drafting of AA's principal document, the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book, which is published in 1939. But anyway, in 1935, these two gentlemen not only are able to sustain their abstinence, but they begin a movement sharing this path that they kind of figure out that today still continues. Millions have benefited from this, and it has profoundly influenced my life. In 1957, a guy named Dick Caron opened a corporation, and in 1959 bought the property over there with the Widow's Peak on it. And so this organization exists in a line of heritage. And in fact, I just went and looked at it, in the Heritage Center that we have sort of tucked away, it's not easily accessible, but there's a letter from Bill Wilson to Dick Caron about a guy I'm going to tell you about. So this place is all connected with this history. And so not the June 10th, 1935 date, but I want to back up the story just a little bit. This turns out to be November of 1934. Bill, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, has a lifelong drinking buddy named Ebby, old-fashioned name. Ebby and Bill are planning a rendezvous on Clinton Street in Brooklyn, where Bill has his residence at that time. I've walked by Clinton Street and seen there's a tiny little plaque on the wall of this brownstone that says this was the home of Bill and Lois Wilson. But it's one of the historic sites of AA, but it's also a private residence. So anyway, Clinton Street, Brooklyn, 1934, Ebby knocks at the door, and Bill has a pitcher of gin and pineapple juice. Ew, disgusting. I didn't even like gin. But anyway, gin and pineapple juice, and he later in a speech says that he had the pineapple juice to kind of keep Lois off his back because she couldn't see how much gin was in there. It's not that she was dumb, but I'm just drinking fruit juice. It just has a little. Anyway, so there's the gin and pineapple juice on the table, and Bill thinks, Ebby's coming over. We can drink all day and reminisce. Like this is going to be awesome. Ebby comes in and sits down at this famous kitchen table. The kitchen table now exists at a historic site in Westchester, but and I've sat at the kitchen table like, ooh, there's a whole like sense of sacredness about these moments. And Ebby sits down at the table, and Bill, pours him a glass and says, "Here you go." And Ebby says, "Yeah, no thanks. I'm not gonna drink with you, Bill. I just came over to share kind of what's going on with me." And Bill is like, "What?" Because he cannot believe that the bondage that he is experiencing is something that his friend Ebby is no longer subject to. And in particular, like, not only is he not drinking, but to have a drink pushed in front of him and not have to pick it up is like impossible. It is this would be, for many of you in the room, it's like somebody, I knew people in my early recovery who said that they were trying to stay clean and sober, and somebody showed up at the door and said, "I have a set of works," like whatever, so this is for injection or whatever. And the trigger activation of craving in the presence of access to the substance or behavior is really, really like the critical moment, because if you can be given freedom from enactment when that craving is triggered, you really have a chance. And if you can't, you really kind of don't have a chance. You're subject to the force of this wicked thing. So tomorrow is the anniversary of the movement that sprung from the awareness of this thing. And so Bill's like, "What?" Ebby starts to tell him that he's participating in a religious movement called an Oxford group, and that turns Bill off, because Bill is like, this is a religious solution. I'm out of here. But Ebby is historically remembered as having said something to Bill like, maybe you could choose your own idea of a power greater than yourself. And so there's a lot of debate about when that and who that phrase gets attached to. But in any case, the movement of Alcoholics Anonymous distances itself from the Christian Oxford movement and becomes a movement focused on freedom from active addiction around alcohol. And today, this place exists because it turns out that movement that was birthed at that time has had incredible success and influence. And I just met near the back of the room is a woman who's here as a graduate intern. We're a teaching center to help, and there's a whole medical, neuropsychological, biological, there are all these disciplines that have come to the table to develop and refine the insights into how to support people who experience this entrapment. But really interestingly, so this is my journey of education is sort of in that same sequence. I started my education around addiction, first of all, being an addict, but then experiencing the liberation through the rooms of the 12-step community. I did not actually go to treatment, which is mystifying to me, but I really should have at least detoxed. And then I didn't have a seizure or DTs is some peculiar grace. But in the years of my sobriety, which count now 34, I've been educated about not only the historic movement of Alcoholics Anonymous and the Big Book, and then emerging on the landscape of human history today are alternative choices, not only all the different flavors of 12-step fellowships, the CMA, SLAA, there's a whole alphabet soup of A fellowships that use the 12-step method and apply it to different sort of like gambling or gaming or sex-related disorders or money-related disorders, and but also some really innovative new approaches like Recovery Dharma, which brings Buddhist principles to support people. And really, they are different. These other things, smart recovery is a different landscape. But in my reflection about how to get to the message today, I have been all over the map. But yesterday, and as I was trying to land the plane and get to this spot where I'm going to talk, one of the things that was really clear to me is a sense of unity about where addiction care is today. And my claim would be that there's more, it's a little bit like wisdom traditions of the world. There's more in common than there is difference in the biopsychosocial, in the neurobiological, in the spiritual wisdom traditions, and in the recovery movements. These are 4 different ways of looking at a person who suffers from these kinds of challenges. But I would tell you at the end of the day, having done a deep dive in all of them, I see incredible commonality. And I, it's a chicken or the egg problem. I think one of the things you can learn is that Dick Caron and a number of other people involved in addiction treatment around 1960 went and lobbied the American Medical Association to identify addiction as a disease so that insurance companies would pay for treatment. And this brought the recovery movement to the medical world, and the medical world started to kind of appropriate the model of addiction recovery. I keep pointing to the 12 steps on the wall. So it's not surprising in that sense that since AA and AA-based recovery approached the medical community, that the medical community said, well, tell us what you do. And so now you can still see this legacy overlap. But the deeper belief that I have is that there's an underlying common solution. There are barriers and there is a freedom. In other words, there are shackles that hold the person. There's stuff that holds us back, and that there are ways to undo those shackles and give people the chance to move forward in their lives. And if you're a brain scientist, you're going to interpret those shackles through the brain science lens, and you're going to interpret the freedom through the neurological interventions. If you are a sociologist, you're going to see those shackles in a sociological way and interpret the movement forward as a sociological thing. If you are a spiritual care practitioner, shamanic, priestly, ministerial, rabbinical trained person, you're going to view this from that lens. And if you are a person like me who also grew up in the rooms of AA, you're going to view it in that lens. But it's one problem, and no one of those people gets to say they have the correct and singular solution in my mind. These are wonderful people who have invested huge amounts of training in their credentialing in 4 of the 5 cases, but also, like, I remember I used to go to this meeting in Washington, D.C. I just loved this meeting because, out somebody who outed himself a long time ago, on Saturday morning I used to see Walter Cronkite at this meeting, and who was one of my lifetime heroes, and so much for anonymity, but he and his journals talked about his journey into sobriety. And anyway, this was the kind of person you see political bigwigs and other people who would come to that meeting. But when there was this woman who was probably like somewhere on the bipolar, autistic, whatever spectrum. I'm not qualified to make those diagnoses, but she was weird. Her name was Pearl. And the thing is, Pearl was like 17 years sober. And when Pearl would weigh in, we all shut up. Because that was her credential. Her credential was 17 years of sobriety. And when Caron first opened its doors, that was a way to become a staff member, was to have time in the saddle. Although with the introduction of medical competency and insurance reimbursement over the last 40 years, 50 years, what's happened is that almost everybody who has the name badge that's underneath my robe here, who has the chance to do clinical interventions with our clients, has to have a master's degree. The fact that I'm 34 years sober is not enough to get me hired here as a clinical person. I have to have training in some other discipline that makes the reimbursement of the insurance company for the care that we deliver. So that's an interesting piece of this. It's like there's been a movement away from respect to the historic solution and a bit of a privileged attitude about the higher, more educated, more professional disciplines. The people who wear the fancy coats and have the ties and have the master's degrees on the wall and all that sort of stuff have become the people who are viewed as the authorities, when in fact people like Pearl are authorities too. You can learn a lot from the grassroots survivor of this miserable condition and from people who have found ways to become unshackled. We're talking about finding freedom, right? This is the essential feel of this thing is, I can't get out. I'm stuck in a hole. I don't know how to move forward in my life. And in fact, not only am I stuck in a hole, but I'm in quicksand and I'm drowning and I'm going to die. That's the feeling of what this is. When it hits you, you become like kid in your stomach, and it's like you have two choices. One is to put the blinders on and keep going, and another is to hear the invitation to freedom from one of these angles. And I'm so glad that all these angles are here, because it turns out some people respond better to the neurobiological angle, and some people respond better to the sociological angle, and some people respond better to the plain Jane, I won't say that, but anyway, the sort of grassroots, street level addiction recovery community. Thank God there's freedom. Thank God there's freedom. And one of the people I work with, he's here in the room, asked me a few weeks ago what I thought was the right way to understand addiction. And this is the sort of thing I started saying is, there are a bunch of right ways. That's what I deeply believe. I think these are not wrong, they're just different. And on any given day, depending on who I've been talking to or what I've been doing, one or the other is in front for me. And it also depends on who the person I'm working with is, because I kind of believe my task is to engage with each of you in a way that allows me to sense what framework will be most helpful to you. And so that's a listening task on my part. And I feel like I'm getting better at that, month after month, year after year. But if I had to tell you my favorites, they probably are, I'm just winging this here, are the psychosocial and the wisdom spiritual lenses. They speak to me. That's probably why they're my preference. So the one way of thinking about the freedom lost and the experience of becoming hostage is, as I was just chatting with ChatGPT the other day about this, and ChatGPT gave me a new phrase, and I was like, oh, that's helpful. Distorted attachment. So attachment is a whole thing in psychological theory, and it's not new. It's been established, and there's a lot of research behind attachment theory, and there's a pioneering book that was published in the 1980s about addiction as an attachment disorder. And so Philip Flores is the name of the author, and so for a long time people have been saying this is an attachment thing. People are also saying this is a brain thing. People are also saying this is a demonic possession thing, and people are also saying this is Alcoholics Anonymous's language is obsession and compulsion. The spiritual lens is hostile takeover. But Carl Jung, one of the great psychological voices of history, also came alongside of that and said, is a very famous phrase, spiritus contra spiritum, and he says that alcohol is spirits, right? And so it's just the wrong spirits that hijack. We're just making the wrong spiritual turn. The attachment theorists talk about distorted attachment, and the reason that distorted attachment manifests, this is the key thing, this is why I'm bringing this up, is wounding. So trauma, fear, hurt, insecurity cause us to be less than skillful or reticent in making the kinds of attachments that sustain the best part of our human life, which are familial and social in terms of having a loved one circle, a friend circle, and then a meaning purpose circle around which you do your work. And in a non-addicted life, when you look at people who don't manifest this peculiar derailment, what you find out is that their family relationships are a place where they're able to rely. Their friend circles are a place where they're able to rely. And they're able to be vulnerable and open in these things. They don't have to mask and hide and feel anxious and blah. And also that they lead lives of meaning and purpose. They're engaged in a work or a teaching, or even the family itself can be the purpose. But they have healthy attachment. They have connectedness. And the whole myth of the self-made man is a terrible myth. It's a lie. It's a prescription for disaster. Our social narratives around masculinity being solo accomplishment, climbing on the backs of those people who you crush in your attainment of better and more and blah, 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 is a invitation to addiction. It may land one person at the top of the pile, but all those people who've been walked on are wounded in their capacity to use social placement and networks to sustain to cultivate their resilience. So this is such a powerful, this is why family becomes a really important thing, because families too have struggled. I haven't said that yet. Families are captive in this thing in a weird way. Families, out of their love for their loved one, don't know how to navigate, because I'm going to pay the electric bill because I don't want my loved one to get out on the street, but then it turns out that they had some money, they go buy more drugs. It's just like, that's like one of 500 instances of how one becomes paralyzed and not knowing what to do. And one acts out of what one thinks is love, but eventually you start waking up to realizing you've been lured into complicity with the tailspin of the nightmare. It's like, I'm addicted, so I have the shackles that attach me to the bottle. But then I've lured you in, and the shackle goes around your ankle, and I've drawn you into the entrapment game. So, forming healthy attachment is also retraining the brain. It's one of that, and this is a really powerful thing. We're working as an organization to see if we can work directly on the brain, and it turns out we can. We have equipment across the street that helps reduce anxiety and depression and obsessive disorders and cravings without actually doing the talk therapy or the shamanic intervention. It's really interesting that these various disciplines allow persons who feel most receptive along one of their lanes to make progress. But if I look at all of the research and I look at the weird history of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, for a long time people said, that's not evidence-based. Well, first of all, that's like silly. The fact that it has existed 89 years and that there are millions of people who have found sobriety, and that you can go to any town and open up an app and find out that there are 100 meetings over the course of the week within 5 miles of where you are, that's evidence. It's just not double-blind studies, there is clear evidence that this works in its manifestation and proliferation on the planet. It's in every language, it's in every culture, it's in every hamlet, it's in every place, and people use it and get well. It's just insanely effective. As it turns out, it's treatment. Treatment really works better than people were given credit for until we started thinking about it as less. We developed ways of measuring its effectiveness, which is, do people need treatment again? That's like a really key thing, readmission. And it turns out that people who get good treatment don't need more treatment in significant proportion. And then when people do need more treatment, it just pushes the question deeper. It's like, well, what is it that in this person's presentation we need to also address in order to help them find the freedom that we yearn for? So, there's some readings ahead, there's some music ahead, there's some prayer ahead, and you all are here, right? So, don't take this wrong. It sucks to be you, right? You wouldn't be in this room if you don't kind of know what I'm talking about, right? But there is a freedom that is coming. Do I have it here? I have an outline somewhere, and the ending of my message, my outline, comes from the Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech, and he moves into this visionary, imaginative time when people of different descriptions are going to come together, and the things that divide us will dissipate, and of course he's coming partly from the African American perspective in which he was raised and which he felt called to sort of bring liberation to, but I have been raised in an addict world, and I feel called to help bring liberation to us. And I believe that we have that ahead of us. We have the capacity to throw off these shackles and to find love and to live in good purpose and to be who we can and are meant to be and to find healing from the wounding that has caused us to go down these painful trails, and to retrain our brains and to recondition ourselves to have the guts to love one another, even though it's so scary, and to be free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty. We can be free at last.